Our next session is Bridging the AI Divide, Unlocking Innovation in Global South Newsrooms. Please welcome our speakers to the stage.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are continuing the discussion about AI, how it's shaping us, where it's taking us, from the mind-blowing possibilities, but also the frightening dystopian future possibility as well. And especially for us journalists and public interest journalism, this sector, what are the issues and questions we should be asking ourselves? How are we and how should we be engaging, innovating, and interrogating the technology, and more importantly, those behind the technology and what that's going to lead up to? So we intentionally wanted to hear from global majority voices, just to make sure that we're not missing anything. Are the same questions and nuances, are there divides different? And how that is helping us build and really move towards and pull towards a better, more public interest journalism future where power is held to account. That's ultimately the goal. We have on my left Susan Comrie from AmaBhungane Center for Investigative Journalism in South Africa, followed by Sannuta Raghu, head of AI at Scroll In from India. And last but not least, David Caswell. He is leading AI applications architect and founder of StoryFlow, and a leading mentor for many newsrooms across lots of different countries, global majority being one region of them. So, let's dive in. State of play. AI in journalism and global majority newsrooms. We'll start with you, David. You've pioneered structured journalism since 2013, 2010 even, headed BBC News Lab and worked with many newsrooms, some in very extenuating circumstances, whether they're in exile, facing sustainability challenges, but you've also had a chance to look at some startling innovations that have come from these same newsrooms. How are they engaging with AI? What kind of questions and challenges are they coming across? Could you take us through a whistle-stop tour?
Yeah, I mean, I think, looking at how AI is kind of rolling out in newsrooms across the world from the perspective of divides is an interesting one, because you look at the obvious divides, the North-South divide, the large-small divide, and so on. And those are the kind of divides that we've all become familiar with in the last decade or two around other aspects of tech and news. But I think the divides around AI are different. So I think the divides around AI are more in terms of things like risk tolerance, things like willingness to engage, willingness to try things, the imagination divides, these kind of less tangible things. And the reason I think that is because I see examples both in places like Norway, the Nordics in general, which I think is kind of one of the leading areas of the world in applying AI to news, but also in places like Latin America and India and even in parts of Africa, where like really imaginative things are going on.
Such as?
In newsrooms that don't really have a lot of resources, right?
Can you give us an example?
So in Norway, an example I would point to is Tromsø. So they're in Tromsø, way up at the north of Norway, relatively small market. Basically, I think they're above the Arctic Circle. And they've been pioneering in applying AI to certain kinds of news gatherings. So they basically have these systems. They systematically kind of read all the PDFs that all of the government entities and so on that they're responsible for being a watchdog on. They're able to sort of consume and read and consider and analyze and contextualize at a scale that they couldn't before. And they've been very aggressive and very enthusiastic and engaged in doing that. They saw this as this big opportunity, very small newsroom. I think they've only got about 15 or 18 people. But they've literally been, I think, world pioneers in that kind of journalism. In even in let me see, in Zimbabwe, in Bulawayo, there's been some very, very early interesting work done on these AI avatars and on using some of the tools that can be used to sort of change how communication happens in a very practical, hands-on, pragmatic kind of a way. That's been kind of interesting. I've seen interesting things happen in South America. For example, there was a very, very pioneering, very sophisticated news contextualization system that a small data journalism newsroom in Colombia built, a newsroom called Cuesta Publica, and they built this system they called Odin that essentially allowed a journalist to take some breaking news about some company or individual in the Colombian elites and instantly contextualize it into a thread for social media and publish that within about 10 or 15 minutes, work that would have taken days beforehand. And so now when a story breaks about a politician or a business person or a company, they can publish the full context on that in minutes instead of in days, and therefore they've built this reputation as this kind of go-to place for instant context. So these are all things that are happening in newsrooms that are tiny, like literally, a handful of people. To use Silicon Valley terms, 2 pizza newsrooms. That's all you need to feed the newsroom. And so there's not a divide there in terms of resources or technical skill or size. There's a divide in terms of imagination and willingness to engage. And I should say, on defense of some of the larger newsrooms, there are very interesting things happening within places like the FT or Schibsted in the Nordics or other big newsrooms. But that divide is still the same. It's imagination and engagement.
It's a mindset, it's a culture, and
exactly.
It's great to see that all these innovations are primarily working towards more efficiencies, reduced time, reduced resources, and that really makes a difference and can leapfrog, to use your word, Sannuta, can leapfrog many newsrooms who need it. So moving on and staying with that culture, that barrier or that real divide into the initial uptake and willing to experiment with technology, how we engage, is really more of a culture, a mindset, rather than resources or a geography or a region. Sannuta, your newsroom, I think, is a perfect example of that scroll. It was from the very get-go established with a business model in mind. One of the founders is a former McKinsey consultant who saw real opportunity in and value in the business of public interest news. There's a purpose for it, and those two aren't mutually exclusive. You can still protect it because it's that your model. And so technology was very much at the forefront, and the culture and the DNA of the people who were the early founders, so much that they invested an AI lab, and that's way, way, way back before the buzz of generative AI came abroad. And so that has actually helped you innovate and uptake and experiment and really be at the forefront of this wave. Could you tell us a little bit about that and a hint and a trailer of what that has led you to unveil? There's a lot of chatter on LinkedIn.
Absolutely. I think the media ecosystem that we operate in India doesn't allow us to expand beyond a particular size. And there are various constraints around this, which I will not get into. But that means that we have to use technology as a force multiplier. So we are 20 journalists. How do we make the most? We're also serving a country of 1.4 billion people. How do you make the most with what you have and use technology as a force multiplier? So that's been sort of ingrained into us right from when we started. And that was one of the reasons. So again, to really highlight it, we have a senior leadership buy-in at our end, which has allowed us to create this AI lab. There is editorial buy-in, so our senior editors are all they are participating in everything that they're building, in everything that we're building. They're also, and that's a fantastic thing because the products we're building are entirely, they're not built in silos. So our editors are participating in what these editorial cues we need to encode into some of the things we're building and things like that. And what's really come out of it? So we've had quite a journey over the last 4 years, and we've built a URL to MP4 tool to start with. Then we moved on to a form-to-form versioning tool, which means you take an article and you can convert it into a calculator, you can convert it into a decision tree, you can convert it into timelines and things like that. But what we identified after having built all this is that if you look at journalism under the hood, we don't really have control on our own data.
Yep.
And what I mean by that is, and to echo what Matthew was saying earlier, so he's enabled pay-per crawl, which means it's going to enable newsrooms like us, really tiny newsrooms like us, to make sure that we are paid for wherever there is value and wherever.
For the value.
Yes, but when you crawl, what is extracted or what is scraped is still an article, right, which does not have cues, which does not have the intentionality and the intuitiveness that an editor or a journalist puts into it. So there are things like temporal precision. So we add things like this happened on Monday,
yep.
right? If you summarize an article, it will most likely take that on Monday off. We add a lot of editorial caution. We use words like allegedly, we use words like likely, we use reportedly, which is almost always taken off, right? There are nested quotes, there are indirect quotes, there are all kinds of things which come to us very intuitively. So to take all this into consideration, what I have proposed as a fellow at the Reuters Institute is something called the news atom, which is how do we add meaning to our work, and it's a metadata blueprint, so that when people from the outside look at our data,
yeah.
they get something that is richly encoded with the intentionality that was originally sort of baked in at our end.
So just to say, Sannuta, and to break it down into other words, is that the way that what's happening now with our data is that I go to an LLM, let's say, and I type in a question or a prompt, let's say, and in order to answer that prompt, it goes and it scrapes, collects, and some of that data that it scrapes is journalistic content, but because the way that journalists in our CMS and backend are not structuring it, unstructured, it's unstructured because we are relying on the human aspects of us going in and saying, here's the context, this is when this thing happened, that's the background, this is the source. We're doing that manually in the way that we have always operated. That is being lost, somehow when that data is scraped. Never mind the whole other debates and organize about do they have a right to the data or not, But even as they are taking that data, by the time it comes to me as the user, it's, to use your word, mulch, maybe. It's a soup, Because it's lost sometimes, it's sense-making, this temporal positioning that you're talking about. And what the news atom now hopes to do is, again, like I said, make sure that the cues that we add in at the origin are encoded and carried forward. In an atom that is undivisible, basically.
Yeah,
and that's how we
essentially.
Store it. Yeah. Well, that's perfect. I'm going to circle back to you and David and talk about how does that link to the bigger, not fight, but the bigger mission of public interest journalism in context of all these threats, these existential threats about the technology and who's behind it and where we're going. I want to move on to Susan, hearing all this great possibility, and this is how we're innovating, and we all have the core mission at our hearts. Regardless of how that's changing and shifting. And we can say that journalism, the business of journalism, or even like our approach to it, has become much more democratized. We've gone from mass comm, one-way transmission, to needing to listen more to our audiences, and as well as we want to be trusted, needing to trust them as well as we are forming and as we are producing this journalism, this content to hold power to account. Susan, from the investigative journalism position, I know that you have, not recently, but fairly recently, completed a 6-month journey responsible AI adoption program that we worked on together and collaborated, with very much the ethical adoption of policies and the governance of AI, very much at the heart and center of that, as we did experiment with AI prototyping, enough to understand how to build guardrails against it. Could you tell us about the shift that has happened for you? And again, you are pretty much as you are interrogating in your investigative journalism story. So what was the skepticism? How has that changed? And are you more skeptic now, or are you more emboldened for the uptake?
Yeah, I mean, so to give you an idea, we are a small niche investigative journalism newsroom based in South Africa. I think when the training was originally offered to us, there was a lot of skepticism within the newsroom. Partly it was just a sense that investigative journalism felt like the last in the line of where AI would reach. And so it felt like we could sort of, afford to allow other newsrooms to go there first. We could sort of afford to ignore it. There were also, very real concerns amongst the journalists around the ethical question of whether we should be engaging, whether we should be looking at adopting AI.
Why?
Well, I mean, I guess the ethical questions around what it will do to journalism, the questions about what it's already doing to climate change, but also, we deal with incredibly sensitive data.
Yeah.
We deal with data that some people have very often risked their lives to give it to us.
Yeah.
And there's a real sort of, there were real concerns in the newsroom about what does adopting more AI, what does that do in terms of, are we exposing our data? Are we putting our sources at risk for the sake of expedience? Mm-hmm. I think, there were obviously also counter-arguments to that. Because we deal with often large troves of data, people who come and just give us like a terabyte of emails or of, unstructured documents, and it's chaos. We're painfully aware of how a single journalist, even a team of journalists, how ill-equipped we are to deal with that much data. So, the idea, the possibility that AI could offer some kind of assistance with that, there's only so much that you can keep track of in your head. Mm-hmm. Even with the sort of the best kind of Excel spreadsheet, it's difficult to process that amount of data. I think for me, what shifted was the initial AI. It was a simple exercise that you guys had asked us to do, a simple audit of the tools that we were using in the newsroom, and the kind of realization that, the horse is already bolted. We are already using tools that rely on AI in one way or another, or that are in the process of integrating AI into their products. Mm-hmm. So rather than sort of treating it as strictly an AI adoption exercise, what we sort of viewed it as was AI adaption. Figuring out how do we become more intentional about how we adopt AI, how we use tools that are, in a way that's grounded in a policy, that's grounded in kind of ethical considerations. Whether that AI adaptation process leads us to AI adoption, or whether we kind of, chase all the horses out of the newsroom, that's still a process that we're figuring out. But it has been fascinating because, just the simple process of creating a policy, and I mean, your research has shown across newsrooms in Africa, people are using AI, but not guided by policy. Yeah. That process has been fascinating because it's forced us to put words to and break down the processes that we would otherwise intuitively be doing. And then using that to try and figure out, these are the parts where AI may offer some assistance, and these are parts where AI needs to stay out completely. Mm-hmm. One of the big kind of sort of issues for us is, we often talk about the human in the loop with AI. The reality is that with the type of investigations that we do, they're incredibly complex. You don't really understand your evidence until you have sweated through it, until you have done the critical thinking work of going through, understanding the evidence, understanding how all the pieces fit together and what the implications of that are. And so in order to have a human in the loop, I mean, our view is essentially that you have to have sweated through and you have to do the critical thinking work yourself. But I mean, I'm very excited by the work that Sannuta and David are doing, because the applications for amplifying the work post-publication, for how it's disseminated, that's really exciting. I think where I am still more skeptical is the involvement of AI in that process of coming to that understanding about the evidence.
I think your voice echoes so many newsroom leaders that we've spoken to and people at the head of media organizations, and the way that they have interacted and worked with AI is very much at the dissemination or the maybe a little bit of the workflow, but not really trying as much as possible to retain that critical thinking skill element until we come up with a way to retain that and embed that maybe somehow in a world, who knows, as the technology changes. So that critical thinking and that the role that we play as journalists isn't lost. Who knows? And on that note, I shift back to David to talk about what's possible. And we were just having a conversation a few minutes ago about just that, the human in the loop and the human on the loop, and how to do that at scale. Can you talk a little bit about the bottlenecks?
You know, I'm just going to put a tiny little hole in that bubble about AI is only useful in distribution, and I think that's generally the case now.
Yeah.
But I think we're very, very close to a time where AI is going to be able to take on pieces of journalism, not all of it, not all kinds of investigations, but pieces of it. On the human on the loop thing, this is a term that Ippen Media in Germany use. This is about a reaction to the realities of human in the loop. So human in the loop is where you use AI, but humans look at everything and check everything manually. And the problem with that is, that's a great place to start and all the rest of it. The problem, though, is that becomes a bottleneck. If you're using AI to increase your scale, to increase the scope of what you're covering, to increase the pace of what you're doing, you can't keep up with AI pace and scale and scope if you're checking every single artifact by hand. And so human on the loop, this concept, is basically about abstracting editorial judgment over a process where the editorial responsibility becomes responsibility over the system, the quality control, the error rate, all of these kind of things. It's a more abstract view of journalism. I mean, that's very early. I think Ippen are well ahead of others on that. But that question is starting to be asked in major newsrooms, I think, all over the place. But turning to investigations, I think the potential for especially agentic systems to take on relatively simple investigations, but at great scale, is becoming very, very real. I just finished up a project recently, for example, where we used agentic AI to completely recreate, step by step, a very large scenario planning project that we did last year around scenarios for journalism in the AI era. That project last year took about 1,000 people, like the input from about 1,000 people was distilled down into a very small set of scenarios. And we did exactly the same project this year entirely with agentic AI. And the results, they were different, but they were sort of comparable. And that's a little unusual, because scenario planning is different than investigations. But I think, changing paradigms, for example, to be able to go from a situation that I think we're in now, where we can do a relatively small number of relatively complex, large complex investigations, there's maybe 2,000, 3,000 investigative journalists globally, to a situation where we can do vastly more investigations. Yes, each one is simpler, but we can do, instead of having 2,000 investigative journalists globally, maybe we have 20,000, maybe we have 200,000, maybe we have 2 million. Most of them are agentic. Most of them can't do the big nuanced investigations, build the relationships, do all that. But they can read PDFs. They can do analysis. They can send emails. They can do a lot of things that simple investigations require. And if they can do that at a scale, and not just at a scale in terms of numbers, but in a way that's continuous, not just sort of periodic. I mean, with investigations right now, you do your investigation, you look at your data set, you publish your stories, you get your award, and then you go on to something else. Machines don't have to go on to something else. They can watch those MP expenses every month. They can look for patterns. They can look for exceptions. It's a different paradigm than investigative journalism now. So I think these tools will change how pieces of journalism are done quite soon. It's already happening in a few places. It will happen more and more.
And it is very much needed because, I mean, the technology, so much if I can, maybe one way to look at it is the technology that's being created by journalists or people working from the newsroom lens is very much needed to almost catch up or redress or fix existing gaps in the technology coming out of Silicon Valley, very much with a different focus and a different lens. So these solutions can only come from necessity, and the necessity will be faced or felt most closely and should be steered by us to have some kind of agency.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's actually an open question, right? I mean, I'd just be completely blunt about it. You know, I think we've got a question in front of us for the next few years, and that is, you know, in this sort of this AI-mediated information ecosystem that's emerging, you know, our existing news structures and processes and organizations and institutions, are they going to transform to match the opportunities and challenges of that ecosystem? That's an option. We can all do that. We all have the opportunity to do that. Or are other players going to come into this world and replace the institutions? The theory on this is the Christian Claysonson's, I can't remember his name, innovator's dilemma, where, you know, in a legacy industry that's being changed by a new paradigm, it's very difficult for legacy players to kind of, you know, essentially step back in many ways to get onto the new paradigm that's moving forward. And I think that innovator's dilemma is essentially what existing institutions and news are facing right now. So I think it's an open question. I think likely what will happen is something in between, where we have new players. Like I think Scroll is a new player in some ways. You know, you have new players that do big things, but you also have legacy players that maybe move up the value chain and do that sort of handcrafted, high-value stuff that persists. Something, you know, some kind of hybrid ecosystem like that, I think, might develop. But you know, I think there's no question that AI will do big chunks of journalism, and that will be a good thing. We need more journalists. We need more investigations. You know, we need all of that, right?
And that's the technology. So about technology or how we're approaching it so that it can actually empower us being the journalism sector and maybe even inspire other sectors feeling just as dystopian sometimes as us, to be empowered as well and to have a little bit of a seat at the bargaining table with big tech. Sannuta, what does potentially the news atom, if applied at scale, if adopted and if taken to the big table, the big meeting table conference with big tech news, how does that empower, how the potential to empower?
Yeah, just taking forward from what David said about units of journalism,
yes.
Right? It's very unsexy to talk about journalism as a data asset. There is value in journalism as a text article, as a podcast, as a video, as whatever else. But I think we should also be looking at it as an asset that is a high integrity knowledge asset, that is also one of the few sources that has verified information grounded in people, events, and places.
And that's value right there.
That is huge value, which I don't think we see for ourselves, right? It's not narrative, it can be, but we also need to explore journalism as a knowledge asset, right? So when we do structure data under the hood at the sentence level, so what I'm proposing is we do this, we assign meaning at the sentence level,
yes,
and encode those cues which come to us very intuitively, which we add very intentionally. When we're able to do that,
yes,
we say, look, rich data is available to you now, right?
You being big tech or LLMs or people behind that new
Anybody
technology
making an LLM.
that relies on content.
Yeah, rich data, which is again verified information grounded in events, places, and people, right? When this is available, it also becomes a credibility issue, right? We're giving you something that is trusted, right? So if you're able to take that, it's a win-win for everybody, and it's a win-win for the information ecosystem.
So it's one bargaining way to perhaps get better paid and compensated, but also you're doing quality journalism, you're safeguarding almost information integrity, because you've made it into an indivisible atom. Those that do take it cannot break away the sense, so harder to lose the meaning.
You're making rich data available. It's not available today. We are not even in that zone anymore, right? So we're making rich data available. So once the availability is fixed, it's tick marked, then you move to adoption, right? Which is, and then that involves collective bargaining. That involves all of us saying, look, it's available. Now you don't have an excuse to not use it.
Yes.
So
and pay for it.
And 100%.
Sorry, if I could just jump in there. I would encourage you all to go to the Reuters Institute website and download and read Sannuta's document from the work she's done on news atoms. And I think for two reasons. One is because of the work itself. But the second one is because, when I talked initially about that divide in imagination, that document is a very, very good place to sort of help to kickstart your mind into fundamentally different ways of thinking about journalism. And I think we're all going to have to work with fundamentally different ways of thinking about journalism in this emerging AI-mediated information ecosystem. That document is an excellent example and a great place to exercise those muscles, those mental muscles.
We're over time, but I do want to go back, final word quickly to Susan, to say after you've heard all of the possibility with the same intention, I would say, ultimately, where you are, what do you need at this stage in your journey as AmaBhungane? Do you see yourself continuing to adopt, or what is needed, do you think, in order to continue, if you would want to, safely?
I mean, I think one of the biggest things that's missing is trust. Being able to trust the sort of big US tech companies. That's really difficult to do at the moment. It feels like our politics in South Africa has stayed the same, and everyone has kind of goose-stepped to the right. When you have incidents like with Grok, where it briefly was sort of spouting this kind of, bullshit white genocide story, that breaks down trust. That was caught because it was so obvious. But yeah, I mean, I think there are real questions. When you have kind of, big US tech companies, the CEOs lining up behind an authoritarian president, people fundamentally do not, that breaks down the trust that we have. So I'd say trust is a big thing for us.
Trust of the big tech, or the big
tech.
Being
able to trust big tech when they say, trust us with your most sensitive data.
Right.
And I think that's a real difficulty for us at the moment. I think the reality is, though, is that, the scenario that Antonio had described in his opening address yesterday, where we have kind of, we are in a situation where we are trying to sort of keep our journalists alive, keep our sources alive, keep our democracy from falling over the edge. AI is not the most urgent tool that we need right now in our hands. So I think adoption for us will be slower, and I think will be more on our terms. I think that's something that's coming through a lot in the conversations that are being had in places like South Africa, is people are saying, we have concerns about bias. We have concerns about how we are being included and depicted in AI. So I'm very encouraged that there are people, and I do think that has to happen at an industry level, people having those conversations about how do we make this better? How do we not just sort of be forced to be told, hey, this is how it is.
Or this is the only way, the inevitability of it.
The inevitability.
So maybe, or if it even is inevitable, aren't there any other sources of innovation and progress that we could benefit from, but are on our own terms or for the public good? Thank you so much, everyone. And I want to thank the speakers, Susan, Sannuta, and David. And again, this is the curtain raiser. Continuing the conversation.